Welcome back to Quality Conversations, folks. This week I'm joined by Stephen Platten, Principal Consultant at Inspired Consulting. We talk about Stephen's journey into Stoicism and how that's impacted his view of QA, the idea of self-sufficient QA, as well as Stephen's philosophy that life cycles matter more than context. So whether you're in QA, looking to get into QA, or leadership, just looking to learn a little bit more about QA, I think this conversation provides a ton of value. I particularly enjoyed Stephen's perspective on Stoicism and how that applies to QA. So as always, my name is Ben Fellows. I'm the CEO of Loop QA. And without further ado, Stephen Platten. Stephen, thanks for joining me.
Hey, good to be here.
Cool, man. Well, so do you mind just introducing yourself to the audience first and foremost, kind of what you've done up to this point, and then more than anything, I think how you got into QA. I always ask that because everyone has a real unique journey.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a principal consultant for a company called Inspired Testing. We're based out of South Africa, but we also have like UK offices and offices around the world. I got into testing off the back of a military career. So I was in the Air Force in the UK for about 14 years. I did trials and evaluation, like a military fast jets, for like the last 5 or 6 years at that point. Stumbled into what was basically testing. I just didn't realize that that's what it was. And then transitioned to a civilian career into a number of companies, Kinetic, who are quite large defence contracts in the UK, and some utility companies and an insurance company. And I've done testing throughout those years. So kind of accidentally falling into it. I didn't study it at university. I didn't have a computer science degree. It was more of an engineering background. So kind of fell into it by accident, which I think is quite common for testers.
Very common. I don't think I've ever talked to someone who said from the age of 12 I wanted to be in QA. It's not a career that seems to operate that way. Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out to me about your experience when we first talked was just the huge variety of teams, structures, different components of Agile, Waterfall, these different things that you've talked a little bit about. And so I'm really looking forward to digging into that stuff. When we were talking about kind of where you wanted to go first and foremost, I do want to lead with sort of a personal detail about you and Stoicism and what you've brought to Stoicism, because I think it's a really unique frame to think about the rest of the conversation through as you've evolved. And so you run a blog called The Stoic Tester. Can you just give me a little bit more context on Stoicism, how it affects you as a tester, and your journey there?
Yeah, sure. So Stoicism is an ancient philosophy. It's thousands of years old. Mainly out of Rome and the Roman area. So like Marcus Aurelius is probably the famous Stoic that people would have heard of, the emperor that's in Gladiator. That's a bit spoiler alert. And Stoicism is a school of philosophy that kind of teaches or predates that the most important thing, or the true source of happiness and fulfillment in life, is the control of how you react to a situation as opposed to anything else, and that's the only thing you really control. And they also specify like 4 key virtues around how you live your life. I've been a number of difficult periods throughout my life, both professionally and personally, and I found Stoicism as a means to help me kind of ride through those difficult times. And then I realized there's actually a lot of transferable practices to being a QA. Like, so often in a QA, things are outside of your control, and we try and kind of cling on to that control that we don't have. Like, ultimately a business can decide to release without us, or without our recommendations. And Stoic teachings has helped me kind of rationalize that mindset and hopefully help people in the testing community take control of what they can control, which is how they react to situations.
Yeah, I mean, to completely echo your point, I think one of the things that I talk about when it comes to QA positions is I think the most undervalued skill is emotional intelligence. I think that QA is put in the middle of a hodgepodge of different personalities and goals, and oftentimes we're advocates, we're teachers, we're so many different things within this organization, and because it's a really misunderstood position and roles, and so I think it was interesting, being someone who's not engaged with philosophical concepts to such an extent in my life, hearing how quickly it clicked for me, this journey that you've gone through in Stoicism, and how sort of applicable it was to QA. And I'm a big advocate that the first time you write your book, The Stoic Tester, if you do ever end up doing that, it seems like it's a book waiting to happen that I'm sure a ton of other people would value.
There's a Stoic handbook written by a guy called Epictetus. So my thoughts around writing a book, but from a testing perspective. So he wrote a handbook of how to kind of defend yourself in life using Stoic principles. So I think the concept is there. I just need to actually bite the bullet and start writing stuff down.
So then, just to stick on this theme for 1 or 2 more minutes, when you think about Stoicism in your life, is there anything example-wise that you can share for someone who maybe is having a hard time thinking about theory to practical when it comes to being a QA
Yeah,
employee or engineer or team member, right? Like, can you maybe provide an example of a situation where you feel
yeah,
like this
sure,
philosophy has
yeah,
helped?
absolutely. So I'll give two examples. I kind of give like a positive example and like a negative example, if that makes sense. So the positive one was around I was working for a business at the time for a client, and um, I was advocating that they needed to do performance testing of a new website change. And the business pushed back to say, well, we've tested this website with 70,000 users, let's say, in the past, and there was no issues whatsoever. So my pushback was, well, how many users are you expecting with a new launch? No idea. So I said, well, we need to do something. Ultimately, they pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And I got to a point where I said, okay, this is how this is going to go. I said, I need you to either let me do it or you take responsibility that it isn't being done, right? Because I can't control you just saying it doesn't need to be done. What I can control is you taking accountability of not doing that, right? Of saying it doesn't have to happen. And funny enough, the business quickly went, well, we're not going to do that, Steve. So you can do the testing. I was like, okay. I thought so. Having to kind of hold them accountable, like that's one of the principles of Stoicism is accountability as well. So holding them accountable, and knowing that I couldn't control them saying no, I could hold them accountable and legally get them to contractually agree. And then as a more negative, I've had quite difficult experiences in another organization, um, kind of bullied and undermined a little bit is what I would kind of, without going into too much detail, and knowing that my self-worth as a tester and what I was bringing to the organization, I could control how I felt about my own work. That someone can disparage my work, discredit it, not agree with that doesn't truly matter. What matters is my opinion of myself and how I think I'm doing. Am I doing a good job? Yes, that's the most important opinion, and that's the dichotomy of control within Stoicism that's helped me manage those kind of difficult conversations. But it has also very positive implications as well. But those two use cases kind of spring to mind when you asked.
Yeah, and just to echo that, what's really interesting is a couple months ago I made sort of a post on LinkedIn about like, being in QA, how I really enjoy the conflict of being in QA, which was kind of a blunt post. There was probably a lot more nuance that could have been put into it, but a surprising number of testers and other folks basically, commented on that saying, we used to fight those fights and we've kind of given up. And when I hear you talk about stoicism, it feels like the perfect middle ground where you can still engage, but you can find peace with understanding that you can control your own emotional reactions to some of these situations. If I'm understanding this correctly,
Yeah, yeah,
where
absolutely.
instead of completely shutting down and just saying, I'm burnt out, I give up, I've tried so hard, it's kind of this idea of like, so many humans are either 100% in emotionally and they're just full bore and they're go, 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 or they're just 100% burnt out and they're like, I can't handle being told no one more time. And then when I hear you talk about stoicism, particularly when it comes to QA, it seems more these strategies around, okay, each time someone makes a decision that is probably not in the best interest of QA, how do you create accountability? And then how do you find peace in yourself and
Yeah,
understanding your own emotional reactions? Is that a fair characterization
yeah,
or am I
yeah,
missing?
absolutely. Yeah, it's about fundamentally it's about understanding what you can control, and the only thing in reality you can control is how you react to a situation. So, in the exact use case examples that I give, where they said we don't think we need to do performance testing, I could have kicked off at them. I could have become very aggressive and abrupt. I could have become unprofessional. Like, you absolutely have to do this. It's the most important thing ever. It'd be catastrophic if we don't do that. It wouldn't have been constructive. It wouldn't have led to any change in the outcome. Right. And the same thing with the situation where I was kind of not having a particularly pleasant experience at work. The same thing, I could have allowed that to affect my well-being mentally and emotionally. I could have allowed it to upset me. Not that I didn't feel those emotions 100%, but I could have allowed it to define how I worked. So I would have become the thing that they were trying to make me out to be, as opposed to kind of sticking by my own standards, what I'm accountable for, whether I'm comfortable with myself. So it's definitely about understanding that someone can say something and someone can force something upon you. It's ultimately how you react to that thing. It doesn't mean always rolling over. It's picking your battles. Certainly, I definitely have done that throughout my career. If I think I'm onto something that is important, I reflect that to the business, and to stakeholders. Definitely.
So I could talk another 15 minutes about this, but there's a couple other elements, and maybe we'll weave Stoicism sort of throughout the rest of the conversation. One of the things that I'm most excited to talk to you about is the variety of experiences you've had in the QA space. And you said a line in when we were talking initially, this idea that life cycles matter less than context. And before I turn it over to you to provide more context there, I mean, you've worked in complete waterfall in teams, agile teams. You've worked in all kinds of different tech stacks. I'm really excited to find what are the parallels, what are the not parallels. There's a grass is greener thing I talk to a lot of QA people where they're
Yeah,
like, well, if only our team was in an agile way, it could be, this, or if only we did this, or and so you use the line life cycles matter less than context. So could you dig into that a little bit for me?
yeah, definitely. So, like, to answer that question of like, oh, if only we did DevOps, we like the world would be amazing. I was like, if you're terrible at what you're doing now, you're probably going to be terrible at doing DevOps. So, it's not a golden bullet. Nothing is. So what I've seen, so I've worked in purely heavily regulated waterfall industries where documentation was like absolutely paramount and standards of documentation was super important. And I've saw the pros and cons of that approach, right? Um, I worked in agile organizations and teams and squads where there's been no, I'm going to use documentation example, no documentation, nothing. Kind of, there's a little bit of confluence, and that was kind of it. And the pitfalls of that, again, so when I talk to the agile people in the room, I'm always agile is an approach, waterfall is an approach, DevOps is an approach, DevSecOps is an approach. Anything is just an approach, and it's entirely dependent on the industry, the individuals, the training, the culture, the tech, anything that you're doing. It's all context dependent. It's a set of tools to apply to a problem. So I'm never an evangelist on a specific methodology. I'm always, well, it depends, and that's how I work heavily with clients. When clients say, I want to adopt agile, my first question back to them is, and why is that? Is that because you think it's going to be quicker, or you think it's going to be faster? You think you're going to get better quality? What is the rationale behind that? Or you just hear that it's good, therefore you want to do it. Like, it might not entirely be appropriate for your organization due to its structure in the industry that it's in. So context mattering more than life cycle or more than methodology in my head is because that's generally been my experience. I've seen very good agile, very bad agile. I've seen great waterfall, terrible waterfall, really good DevSecOps and DevOps, and anything between. And also, like, I'm also a hugely advocate of whatever works. So if you have to kind of adapt to like a agile process, if you've did that before, because your industry requires it, like a heavy amount of documentation up front before you go into your sprints, but that works for you, then we'll just do it, right? Is it slowing you down? Is it impacting quality? Is it what the downsides? We have to do it because of regulatory reasons. Well, then let's just do it. Then let's not like force our organization into this model because the industry says this is the best model for you to use. It's entirely dependent on your specific client and industry.
Yeah, so then let's dig into that for a second. What does context mean to you, right? Because you kind of referenced it with the team structure, because like what you're arguing, right, is what arguing is a strong word. What you're laying out is that life cycles matter less than context. So then something has to matter. So what matters, what context actually does matter? Team structure, roles, like what actually
Yeah,
though should be something to be thought about.
yeah. So like, I want to like maybe a top five. I would say the people matters immensely, and I'll break that down a little bit. By people, I mean how mature are they in their practices. So I've worked with developers who have done nothing but waterfall for 20 years, and then for the business to say to them, "You now need to do agile," it just doesn't. It's not going to work. So the context there is that their experience is heavily going to dictate how they want to work, right?
Yeah.
People is a big one. Then so the second thing would be the industry. I would say the context of your industry, non-regulated versus regulated, a speed to market versus non-speed to market. So within the insurance sector, then I've worked, speed to market was key. So DevOps was obviously the best way to produce things. They wanted to push code on an hourly basis, certainly a daily basis. Works in the utility sector, they need to produce things before the regulator gives them a deadline, which is in 2 years' time. Agile doesn't really necessarily fit well in that approach potentially, right? So your industry is the second thing. I would even say like budget constraints. So I'm talking to a company in the defense sector, and they have huge budgetary constraints that prevents them from adopting certain tool sets that fits well within DevOps, right? So having Jira licenses and all these kinds of things potentially isn't going to work for them because they're a startup. That's a constraint certainly, or it's context. I would say the culture in the client or in the business, what they think testing is. So in the utility sector, testing, in my experience, was a gated process. You wouldn't get through the release gate until QA give you a tick in the box. I've worked in defense organizations where quality is sort of considered from day zero. So documentation is of a very high standard, processes of a very high standard, and have version control and all these kind of good practices are also in it. And I think the last thing maybe ties in with people, I guess, is like what are people's experiences of these different life cycles and working within them. If you've got a very mature agile team, it's maybe a bit easier to adopt it from scratch. But then again, a team that hasn't used it is also going to be open to new experiences, right? So, like in the startup example I used, I've said to them, like, just try things, right? Like, let's just pick a couple of different methodologies, run them for a couple of months, and see what works for you, what fits, what's culturally and when the organization going to work for you. So it's all that's what I mean by context, the kind of those general 5 factors.
Yeah, I mean, to echo this, right? Like one of the things that I find so fascinating in my engagements when I work with people is that they want to make these like widespread sweeping changes. So they say like, well, if only we could change from, a 2 week sprint to a 4 week sprint somehow, that they think that's going to be better, or a 2 week sprint to a 1 day release cycle. And then when you stop and look at a lot of their problems, it's like, well, your acceptance criteria is missing a ton of detail. And so it's
Yeah,
like it goes from this like high level thing where it's like, well, if you just tried to answer every question and break down your requirements to the minimum possible steps and clarify things just in your acceptance criteria, that's the root of a lot of your problems. It actually doesn't have to do with a lot of these components. And it's an interesting thing that I find with a lot where, um, and I don't know really what the root of it is, right? This idea of maybe it's the human nature to think like, oh, this widespread change would fix everything, and they almost kind of miss the little detail component. I mean, it's in
yeah,
the personal example, right? It's like, oh, I'm constantly um like this is going to be a stretch, but I was thinking like recently it's like, oh, my credit card debt's constantly going up too high, and it's like I need to make more money, and it's like, or I could just control the spend. It's just an interesting like
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So
I think it's maybe a compartmentalization of thinking, right? So critical thinking is something I was hugely advocate of. It's people skim the top layer of a process, right? So like I've watched some stuff on YouTube about DevOps. I've got it right. So DevOps will fix all the problems. So I was like, maybe, but I was like, how many books have you read about DevOps? How many people have you spoke to about it? How long have you been doing it for? Right. That having that detailed understanding will allow you to make those decisions. But because people don't have that ability, they just generally go off kind of gut feel. Like, I think this is the problem. Well, where's the evidence that that's the problem? What do other people think that is the problem? Have you asked them, or is that
yeah,
the conclusion you've come to?
yeah.
Especially in like a top down organization, if the release managers are saying the problem is the fact we do 2 week sprints, not 3 week sprints, and then you got a junior QA analyst going, actually, I think it's because you don't have very good acceptance criteria. It's just a shouting match, and the person at the top is going to win the shouting match, and that can be a reason, right? So it's not really a tech problem; it's really like a human psychology issue more than anything else in my head.
Yeah, I mean, and which makes sense, right? Anytime you have teams, any industry, I think what we just talked about for a second there goes well beyond just QA, right? It goes back to
Yeah,
team structure, it goes back to all of the different components. So then
definitely.
continuing to sort of look through your journey, right? I'm going to ask you a question that I know is a sort of a false flag question in a way, but like, what's the best way to do QA? Because I know the answer, which is whatever works, but I want to
Yeah,
ask
depends.
you, what's the best way of doing QA?
um, hmm. I mean, I'm trying to not give you the answer of it depends.
Which is
It's completely
which
dependent,
is
right?
fair. I guess it because
The
give
answer, but I'll try and give you a gut feel, right?
that or give like every QA person in the world, right, is being asked by their boss at some point, what's the best way of QA?
Yeah,
So help that person explain to their boss, it depends.
yeah, okay, right. So there's no point me saying to you the best way to do testing is um, within a scaled agile model, right? If your company is a tech startup and there's 6 of you, there's no point in doing that, right? There's no point me saying to you, I'll use the start beginning because another good example. There's no point me saying to you the best way to do testing is to have a huge strategy document which defines all the things that you're going to be doing and why you're going to be doing them when there's three of you, right? But it matters more when there's 200 people working for you, right? You need to have some kind of high level structure and strategy to get the best out of what testing is going to be, right? So there's a scaling example, right? Another example would be if we say, well, automation is the key and none of your testers have got automation skills, they're all manual. I was like, that might be the answer, but it can't be the answer right now. It's something you're going to have to work towards: upskilling, training, bringing people in, whatever that's going to be. So that to me is what I mean when I say it depends, because there's so many constraining factors that aren't related to testing best practice, which will affect the outcome, right?
Yeah.
The speed to market example would be another one. Is if you saying, well, I want 100% coverage, which in my head is not a thing, before we go to release, and they want to push code on an hourly basis, how likely is he going to hit 100% coverage? You're not. So why try? You're just burning effort for no reason, right? So it's in QA in my head, when it works well, is when it balances what testers are trying to advocate for, which is good quality, and the businesses need. And it's when they're fighting against each other, when the approach doesn't work, when they're in unison and there's a bit of compromise on both sides, a bit like in politics. Politics tends to work when both sides kind of disagree but slightly agree on points and then blend in the middle. That's what I think effective QA is when the needs of QA and the position of QA is balanced with the needs and the wants of the business.
Yeah. So you saying that, right, triggers this immediate thought, which is I think that if you can do it, like the best thing to do is if someone says, well, what should we be doing for testing? The immediate answer is, what are your business goals, right? Do you want to grow customers? Do you want customers to have no bugs? Do you not care about bugs with customers? Do you want to, like, there are so many business goals that should drive QA that it's like, well, we can't make those decisions until we understand what do you want to optimize for, right? Do you want to optimize for the business goals are we want to release features as fast as possible to customers. Well, the next question, do the customers care about bugs, or these early adopter customers where they're more interested in the feature and they're comfortable with the idea that there's going to be some issues with it? So really what you want is you want a lot of features out there that don't take down the whole system, but it's all right to have little bugs. Cool. Then we can answer the best way of doing QA. And what I find fascinating is sometimes how hard it is for QA teams I talk to get answers about what are the business goals. They're told, we'll just test everything, we want 100% coverage. It's like, well, that only makes sense if you're comfortable with us also, like, I mean, 100% coverage doesn't make any sense at all, sort of, because it's not a thing. But let's just say that they are saying, well, we want extreme stability. Well, that's going to slow down everything, right? Because we're going to find bugs, and then after bugs get retested, not only are we going to retest the bugs, we're going to rerun regressions, like all of these different components, right? And then if they're like, well, it's going too slow, it's like, well, you told us this was the priority, not we want to ship features to customers like with some level of risk. So it's interesting just listening to that, being like, if I was in that position, figure out how to say, great, I'll tell you the best way if I can get this context. What are the business goals? What are the feature? What are the customers expecting from the roadmap? What commitments have we made? Okay, within that context, I can lay out options.
Yeah, and that's where you come into like the business focused tester versus the tech focused tester, right? Like if you hear that those the two categories, right? That's where a business tester comes into. That's what I consider myself as. That's where that really comes in key, because the tech guy is probably going to come up with an amazing automation framework that's going to reduce your regression pack down to running in hours as opposed to weeks, right? But without the context of why we need to do that, he's just doing something because he thinks it needs to be done. So having that understanding of what the business is like is super useful, which is why I think you'll see a lot of testers move around industries a lot. And part of my career moves have been due to that reason, because the testing challenges within the utility sector are different to a financial sector, which is different to commerce, which is different to kind of like an industrial plant or something like that. They all have very different challenges to testing for their own specific reasons. So when you say what's the best approach, it'll depend on the industry hugely. So that's an important thing to get out. And I think to answer your question of how does a tester get that out of the business, it's attending those things that you don't really want to attend generally, which is those big company-wide briefings of like here's our 2 year plan and here's our strategic vision and our goals and stuff. So what I would advocate in that scenario is reach out to your head of QA or your test manager or leads or however you structured and say, I've seen what the strategic vision of the company is. What does that mean to us? How does that impact us? What how can QA support that answer? So there's a book called The Phoenix Project, I don't know if you've read, which is about like successful implementation of DevOps. Really good book. And that talks about that IT was disconnected from the business, right? And the IT was doing what it thought was best, but the business's goals were over here, going somewhere in a different direction. And to get DevOps right, you need to align the business's goals with IT's delivery ability, and QA is part of that IT delivery. So it's a hugely important factor.
That's awesome. So last topic for today, and I actually don't have a timer. I should have started a timer. The other
Okay.
system that we use has a timer, so I have no idea how long this has been going for. So apologies if we've just been going. These kind of the conversations I could just talk to forever. So we'll do 5 more minutes and we'll wrap it up. The last
Sure.
topic we've talked a little bit about is this concept of self-sufficient QAs.
Yep.
Before I start to pontificate about that, what does self-sufficient QAs mean to you?
Yeah. So in the context, my experience was within financial sector client, and a self-sufficient QA was someone who could do everything they needed around testing without having to look to someone else. So they could spin up environments, they could generate test data, they could get access to tooling, they could write the code themselves, they could get access to business requirements, they could create tickets for account access. There wasn't a point of like, oh, I have to wait for so and so to give me that, or only Dave on a Wednesday can give me access to this system. They were sufficient enough that they could do as much as possible themselves. And there's obviously a few things that they're always going to be outside of the remit of the squad to deliver. But generally, that's what I mean by self-sufficient, is that they can, that there's no delay between them needing a thing and them getting a thing, because they can get it themselves or create it or spin it up, as an example with environments.
Now, is that a term that you've sort of made up yourself? Is that a term that one
Yeah,
of the
but
organizations that you've worked at?
yeah, I don't think I'm not on a patent pen the term. I think they use self-sufficient teams. I think was the terminology, and I said, well, so we need self-sufficient testers. So this all came around because the squad I was working at the time had a lot of issues with the environment, getting the environment stood up and stable. And they kept going back to the support desk and other people to kind of get help to spin this environment up. I said, do that, but keep documenting how this is getting fixed. Create a repository, just build your skill set up so that once we've got it working, we don't need them again. We
Yep.
can do it ourselves, right? That's the ultimate end goal. The support desk get the calls come down, that they get freed up with capacity, they can do the work. And if every team did that, the support desk could focus on like, oh, we've got a bug in production. Like let's throw all hands to the pump. So it helps other teams by you becoming self-sufficient as well.
So the most common example that I find, and I always try to ask people who are in QA is, can you deploy your app locally, right? And one of the things, it's tons of QA people. It's like they've never been considered it, and the answer is no. We probably don't have access to do something like that. And it's like, okay, so every developer has their local dev environment,
Yeah.
and yet we are not able to deploy the app locally. And it's like, then how yeah, it just, that's just not a pet peeve necessarily, because it's just one of those things where I'm trying to figure out how to articulate some of these things in a way that, like, these light bulb moments that have gone off in my brain of,
Yeah.
like, if you're deploying the app locally, then when there's a feature branch, you can just pull down the feature branch and then test the feature,
Yeah.
and you're not gated behind some test environment or anything else. And it's like, I don't quite understand why we've not embraced this stuff.
I think like part of that is maybe an element of testers not being considered as technical as developers in some cases,
Yeah.
and that you're just testers. You just need to look at you. That's not your job, right? That's something a dev would do. You don't need to do that. So I think there's maybe a little bit of a phenomenon around like testers aren't that technical. I've got some crazy, incredible testers that could do everything a dev could. They just decided to test. Um, so I think maybe that's an element of it as well. And also like the things like, how is that company done it in the past? It's like, well, we've never done that in the past before. We've always had this. This is the way we've always done things, right? That obviously that meme. So there's an element of that, I think, as well. As like, that's a very new thing for some companies to do or want to do. And how do you sell it back to them? As again, you flip it back to, it allows them to become more self-sufficient, to not have to ask people, which means those people have more capacity in the sprint. which means those devs can just crack on with their own work. They're not having to like, constantly answer questions from QA because they've done it themselves. So everybody wins, right? QAs hate being the people that hold things up, right? I don't know what you are. I hate being seeing a Kanban board or a sprint board and us and it going in test and us being the bit that's holding it all up because we haven't got the environment ready or the test area isn't there or whatever it is. Like that drives me insane. I don't want to be the people that can quickly get pointed at. It's like why is test so slow?
Yeah. No, I agree. Zoom is yelling at me that we're running out of recording time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Stephen, this was awesome. I will, if it's cool with you, I'm sure in the next couple of months want to schedule a follow-up or something because I could probably
Yeah,
dig into
absolutely, man.
stuff for a long time. Stephen, you have the Stoic Tester. Are there any other resources or things that you want to shout out that people should
Yeah,
go
sure.
to if they want to learn more about you?
Yeah, so obviously I can share my LinkedIn page. But from the company perspective, so I'm on a podcast called Testing Experts with Opinions with Liam and the rest of the test architecture team. So the podcast we just pushed out recently was on mentorship within QA, how to become a mentor, how to mentor at scale was a big question we spoke about. So that series we run. We also have a YouTube channel as well, Inspired Testing YouTube channel, where we put a lot of content out. We try and create collateral in the community for the benefit of others. Even if it's free stuff that we could maybe commercialize, right? So there's pros and cons to it, but it's a good avenue of good set of resources to have a look into as well. And I'll feature on quite a lot of the content there.
Perfect. Yeah, what's quite funny is that, and I don't think I mentioned this, we're technically competitors, you and I. So
Yeah.
we're supposed to be, like
Well, I think
raising the.
my thing with QA is even when we are competitors, we're all allies, we're all in the same community, helping each other.
No, I agree with that 100%. Well, this was great. I really appreciate you joining me, and I'm sure other people will really
Appreciate it.
enjoy it. All
Yeah,
right.
that's awesome. Nice to meet you. Thanks, man.
Talk
Cheers.
soon, guys.